So, good morning once again, ladies and gentlemen. We're good to go with our session on challenges in coffee cultivation and the role of research. I'd like to introduce our first round of panelists, and perhaps they'd like to join me on the stage. They include Hans Faessler, CEO of NKG Tropical Farm Management, Bill Ristenpart, founding director of UC Coffee Davis Coffee Centre, and Tim Schilling, founder and CEO of World Coffee Research. You can find more details about their biographies on the app. Ladies and gentlemen, this first session will last approximately 45 minutes. And as you know, we're going to discuss the challenges in coffee cultivation and the role of research in cultivating coffee and elsewhere in the supply chain. We may have time for a few questions at the end of the session, and if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and give your name and your affiliation. Now, I think we're all familiar with advances that have been made in the last 5 years in understanding the genetics of crops like coffee and the potential role that understanding coffee's genome could play in the development of better planting material that will be able to withstand the challenges of pests and diseases and the effects of climate change. That understanding has also got a role to play at the other end of the value chain, helping us to develop better tasting varieties of coffee that will meet future consumer demand. You may also know that researchers at UC Davis recently released the coffee genome for coffee Arabica. And only a few days ago, a partnership led by Lavazza and Illy Cafe released what they described as the first fully open access Arabica coffee genome. So it's some of these developments that we're going to talk about now. Tim, I wondered if we could start with you, and if you could start the ball rolling by telling us about the big picture in coffee research, and what in your view are the biggest challenges facing farmers, and why so many of these challenges seem to have come into acute focus in recent years.
Okay, thank you. That's a big question. I think the biggest challenge, obviously, everyone knows about it and hears about it, that of the changing climate, but it's not so clear as just the climate change. Climate change is very complex, and we are, and it's not just the fact that the temperature is getting higher that is the real challenge or threat to the industry. But let me just preface that by saying that in fact, the 1 degree Celsius increase in global temperature actually will already have a negative effect on coffee cup quality. That's a fact. And the other things that we see occurring in the producing countries is kind of like intermittent droughts, flooding, these kinds of problems. But behind that, are to us in agricultural research, are the real challenges for farmers in the sense that the climate change exacerbates these the other challenges. And most notably, I think, is the coffee leaf rust. And you'll remember back in 2012, the big crisis in Central America. And today we are in a very precarious situation with coffee leaf rust. Temperature has gone up again. And at the same time, just as in 2011, market prices are very low. Extremely low, and that has led to farmers not being able to invest in the plant nutrition and fungicides and everything. So we're probably more vulnerable now than we need to be. On top of that, we have we do no longer have an institute that is charged with coffee leaf rust research and development work. We had one in Portugal. still exists in name. However, it's not as functional as it was before with the departure of Victor Varzea and others. So we no longer have a center where we can, in breeding, test new materials with rust resistance to make sure that they are indeed resistant to the rust. This is what the Portuguese center used to do. So that's I think is a huge challenge. But let me just say one for me who has worked a lot in this area. I think the greatest challenge though is that we coffee research we're able to produce technologies to remedy, to give solutions. We don't have a problem with that. We are not scared of climate change. However, getting those solutions into the hands of farmers, to us is the real threat. I think that is the biggest threat we face, because small farmers especially are generally off the supply chain matrix, and many times small farmers are the major producers of the specialty industry, which is driving a lot of the market.
Yeah.
So,
indeed, getting technology to farmers is something perhaps we could return to later on in this discussion.
good.
So, Hans, in your role at Tropical Farm Management, you must see the problems facing farmers at first hand. What are they telling you about the issues that they face? And are they the same challenges that they've always faced? Or are there some new ones that are being brought about by a changing world?
Well, thank you, David. Well, first of all, I like to underline that I'm speaking here on behalf of the producers for the plantations I'm in charge of in the Norman Group, but I'm also a farmer myself in Tanzania, so I'm directly affected by today's coffee world. But I'm not going to do the talk you maybe would expect usually from a producer like myself. I would rather allow me a small excursion into another direction. I think the biggest challenge, if I have to pick one, is not necessarily the agronomy in the field or climate change. I think it is the massive revenue fluctuations of farmers. Now, how does this revenue fluctuation come about? It is about market distortions. Now, if you look at the market of the last 35 years and even before, the market provided consistent growth of about 2%. And the market is diverse. It is diverse, and therefore there's a room for everybody in this. So say in these last 35 years, the market have added 81 million bags of demand. So every country would have every time to adapt and plan and take advantage of this market. But in my opinion, the world is dividing. It's dividing by you have driving countries which have a political will, who invest in research and development, who provide solutions to the farmers. And that this works with smallholders is shown by Colombia, for instance, and in case of plantations, it's shown by Brazil. Now, only about 97, 98, the top 5 producers, provide about 54% of the market. Today, this is 71%. And if it continues, and it likely continues at that pace, they're going to take more than 80% in the next 15 years. So what is then the difference? I think the countries have to wake up and also do research and development. And as David says, unfortunately, often this is not taking place. And therefore, I think other people have to step in and provide solutions and give the support. Now, is there a solution to these enormous distortions? We are going, everybody here knows that the market is going down. We are already below 100 cents. And given this enormous build of production and productivity, namely in Brazil, we're having 16 million stocks in the world and global stocks, and we're having an overproduction of probably in the range of 8 million bags in this year alone. So what are the solutions? I don't think there is an easy solution at all. The thriving countries like Brazil, they have, for instance, in these 8 years of pretty good remunerative prices in the last 8 years, they're very remunerative prices. They have massively invested in renovation of parks and above that in mechanization. And the mechanization replaces human labor. Whether this is desirable or not, I'm not qualifying this, but it has been done. And labor cost is the biggest production cost element on every manual farm. So in many of these countries, you cannot do away, but you can do a lot. You can make the farms more efficient. If you go at the slopes of the Cordillera in Central America, you still find so many farms who farm hopelessly inefficient. Still slopes with a production of 2-3 bags. That might have been okay 50 years ago when a worker earned 1 peso a day. It's not okay today. The world is competitive. The market's demand for this type of coffee. But I think countries have to develop a political will. And this is what those thriving countries have in common. They have a political will, they do invest, they provide solutions to the farmers, and if those countries want to be around in the next 25 years, something has to happen.
So at the very moment when countries are facing new challenges, they have financial constraints on them because of the price, which are making it ever more difficult to address those.
The prices have been very remunerative in the last 8 years. I mean, money was made by
perhaps not used
farming.
in the way that you're suggesting. Sure. Okay, so this is a question for all of you, I guess. One of the oldest problems coffee farmers have faced is the lack of access to top quality, high yielding and disease resistant growing material. Tim, Hans, Bill, is that still the case, and how might the situation be improved? And how can you get good quality planting material into the hands of farmers and enable them to meet the requirements of the roasters in the next decade?
Well, this is what I was saying. This is a huge constraint in the industry, and we've just to make a point on that, that the coffee industry, the coffee sector, it's one of the few, if not, it's one of two of the only major commodities that has no seed or seedling certification system. Many farmers do not know what they have in the ground even. And if they do, what our DNA fingerprinting work has shown over the last 3 years is that almost 30%, almost 50% actually, they think they have, for example, Caturra, and it's not Caturra. It's another variety indeed, and that's because the germplasm collections in these producing countries have been not well maintained over the many years, and it's frankly it's a mess, and it's difficult to even get it up. So we have at World Coffee Research we have established a protocol, a certification, a seed and seed producer and nursery certification system that we are trying to incorporate in many countries right now. We're working in 23 countries, and I think this is certainly a major problem. Maybe Hans, if you want to.
Yeah, I would like to pick up the climate issue, the climate that was named before, and in this context, of course, Robusta. Robusta, unfortunately, has been a sub-orphan of an orphan crop. I mean, in seed industry, we're talking about the multi-billion-dollar seed for the annual crops, because there's a big demand every year. Millions and millions of hectares are replanted, so there's a lot of value in seed and in the progress, and researchers say that even in the next 15 and 20 years, by genetic research, still annual crops still will grow by about 1% from the genetic side, not the agronomy, the genetic side. So coffee has been left all behind. No, there was no interest in this because you plant a coffee field and it should last for the next 20, 30, 40 or even more years. So the interest is very low and it has been very much a local issue. Now, coming back to what I already said, that too little is done in many countries. I think one sleeping giant is Robusta. I think Tim and I probably would agree to that. And
Yes.
many of especially yesterday in more in the fancy industry and so, there's still some people who, when I said Robusta, everybody was giggling. And I think here our industry participant who don't giggle about Robusta, but Robusta has an enormous potential, not only as one of the solutions to climate change, because it's a tropical crop which can tolerate high temperatures, but it's also a coffee type, it's not a variety type, which is a bit prone to water stress. Especially those clones which have not been kind of further selected, which are still rainforest plants in many countries. Taking off the rainforest, 1,000 plants, take the best trees, my clone. There's a lot of work can be done on this in this aspect. And in some of our farms, we have started already 15 years ago of cultivating different clones, and we see massive differences in productivity, in cup quality potential, and in drought tolerance. So there is definitely much substance in there. And then finally, if you treat Arabica like some of the Robustas are treated, strip the trees, throw it on the floor and sticks and chicken walk over it, what happened to Arabica? It's a terrible coffee as well. Therefore,
Exactly.
if Robusta is harvested in a proper way, processed, maybe even wet processed, or semi-wet, whatever how you want to call it, and then properly dried, it gives already an enormous growth in value of that coffee. And I think also you see already some Central American countries growing good Robusta, and the leader is of course India, which has a long culture and have treated Robusta and Arabica equally. That's why India is so far in a good quality Robusta, which finds its way in the specialty market. So I think from the quality capacity, as well as from the capacity to be one of the solutions to climate change, Robusta will play a major role.
Right. Bill, can you tell us a bit more about the role of genetics and the role that might play in understanding the genome and getting good quality material into the hands of farmers? What role do you see for the genetic piece?
Well, it's crucial. So at the UC Davis Coffee Center, we have about 40 faculty involved in coffee research. I'm a chemical engineer, but we have geneticists and plant scientists on board. Something, the type of research that WCR is doing in terms of developing new cultivars, designed for drought resistance or designed for rust resistance, things like that. That's essentially what you're doing is manipulating the genetics. But where the role that my side of things, where we play roles, the genetics is not sufficient by itself. You also have to deliver something that ultimately tastes good and that you can sell to your customers. And so something that I think historically has been lacking in coffee, because coffee historically has been kind of an orphaned crop academically, is where is the kind of neutral arbiter, quantitative arbiter of academic reality for coffee. And so that's one thing we're trying to set up at UC Davis, a place where we can do detailed experiments on how, as the things Hans was just mentioning, like how is it really true that Robusta can taste better with this proper post-harvest processing? I mean, it's kind of an article of faith, and especially coffee, especially that Robusta just tastes bad. You have that burnt rubber taste. That's just because of Robusta. Maybe it's just because of the chickens walking over it, the inadequate drying. And so having a place to do systematic, rigorous testing of sensory descriptive, chemical analysis to really elucidate the mechanism of how the coffee quality develops from the DNA all the way through all the different steps of processing to what the customer tastes and senses. That's what we're trying to set up.
Fair enough. I think at UC Davis you're also doing more work recently on the other end of the supply chain. You're also doing work on post-harvest techniques and on obviously on the coffee genome. Can you tell us a bit about the strands of the work you're doing with partners like Marzocco and your pilot roastery, your green bean storage and sensory and cupping lab. How does that play into this whole piece?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, so for the people in the room who aren't familiar with UC Davis, we have a very long history as a in viticulture and enology. So we have a world-class department, about 20 faculty focusing on wine. We have great programs on beer, on plant science, plant pathology. Historically, we've basically paid no attention to coffee. And the short reason for that, and it's not just UC Davis, it's basically every university in the United States, because coffee is not grown in the United States, there was never never a governmental impetus, no push to have coffee academics. And so over the past few years, my colleagues and I have been trying to change that. We've founded the UC Davis Coffee Center. One of the most exciting things for us is that we have a whole building on campus that we're renovating and turning into a dedicated advanced coffee science and education facility, which I think will be the first in the nation, in the United States, focusing specifically on coffee science. And so, as you mentioned, we have we're going to have an experimental green bean storage facility. Lots of unanswered questions about the chemical and biological degradation mechanisms that affect green coffee during storage. We're going to have a pilot roastery, Pete's Coffee. I know there's some people from Pete's here in the crowd. They gave a founding gift for the pilot roastery, which, since I should mention it, it is going to be equipped with Probat roasters. So thank you, Wim, for that. And so also the La Marzocco Brewing Espresso Laboratory, a chemical analytical laboratory, classroom space. Everything you need for advanced coffee science and education, so we can really fill that academic gap for the coffee industry.
Fair enough, thank you. I'd like to address this question to all of you in turn. Do you think the industries have woken up to the need to preserve coffee's genetic diversity? And what does genetic diversity mean in terms of an opportunity to grow better coffee and to grow better tasting coffee? Tim?
Yeah, well, first of all, you can look at genetic diversity as kind of like a treasure chest of genes that provide resistance to diseases, quality traits, and this kind of thing. This is what you need for assuring the future of coffee. And indeed, there are currently 15 countries with germplasm centers around the world. And of those 15, there are actually only 2 that have been well maintained and could actually serve for this purpose. We worked with the Crop Trust, which is one of the International Agricultural Research Centers, to produce a conservation strategy for genetic diversity in coffee. That we published that last year, and we are looking to see how we can actually fund this so that the germplasm for coffee, not just coffee Arabica and Robusta, but the other species involved, can be preserved over a long period of time. Your question on industry response, I can tell you now is, for the last 18 months since this work, and Crop Trust has been active in seeking sponsors, endowments, funding for this. They're looking upwards towards, they're really looking for an endowment of a minimum of $50 million. But there's been very little interest or activity around that. So it's extremely important, but we do not see industry really connecting or diving.
Why do you think that is? Do you think that the research hasn't really got across to industry how important this is, or what the potential benefits might be? What's the reluctance?
Well, I think maybe industry feels like it's very esoteric, and I think that I don't think that maybe we in science have articulated the importance of conserving the coffee genetic resources to industry. But this is basically the bank of tools and materials to face the challenges of the future. And if we do not do something to conserve coffee germplasm, we will probably be just fine for the next 20 years, but after that, if these collections disappear, if species are with climate change disappear, the probability that we will not be able to face these challenges later on are very, very high. And this is something that needs to be addressed, and we're trying to address it, but it's so far it's proven difficult.
So Hans, what's your take on it? Do you see it as esoteric or essential?
Well, I mean, first of all, most of what is grown today on the world are, in case of Arabica, are virtually half brothers, half sisters with a genetic base, which comes out of the history. I mean, what has happened is once in a while there were mutations which were picked up, one single plant somewhere in Brazil, and there was a Caturra, and that was then used to build up, or something in Timor. So that what the basis was on for breeding. And Tim knows better than me, but you need genetic distance to create new potentials. And because, I mean, GMO is no issue so far in the coffee industry. It may be forever or for a long time to come. It's not. So other ways have to be found, and the only source of genetic diversity is where coffee originally came from, obviously Ethiopia and maybe a little bit of Sudan. In case of Robusta, which obviously, as we see, how much more market share has been taken by Robusta in the last 3 decades, so that is likely to continue to take an ever bigger share. So a lot of focus should be on Robusta because very little has been done on Robusta. A lot on Arabica. In decades ago, there were very good coffee institutes in Arabica, did a lot of breeding. So, and say, like take Senicafe in Colombia, or you take, that there are very good institutes in Brazil. They have been working on this a lot. So Arabica, in my opinion, is out better at the moment. But so focus need to go on Robusta now. Right. And there I can only support you to say, I mean, Robusta has its home in the Congo basins and up to Guinea, and these forests are disappearing.
Yeah.
And I think you have to be fast to preserve those wild species in the forest, to preserve the base for breeding.
Yeah. Bill, what's your take on genetic diversity and its potential importance in future?
I mean, Hans and Tim heard me make this point yesterday, but I think one important consequence of climate change is that regions that are not now growing coffee soon will be. And so, a couple of weeks ago, I was in a coffee farm in Santa Barbara, California. So, right now they're growing just a little bit of coffee, but now it's possible to, buy California coffee as an origin. And they sold it to Blue Bottle Cafe for quite a large price right now. And so as we go forward, to your question, genetic diversity, as we keep, as climate keeps warming up and as different regions come on board, which cultivars are, optimized for these different microclimates and these new environments. I mean, the farms in California, they're only at about 100 to 200 meters. I mean, like they're like a place that you wouldn't really consider for coffee, but they're making really world-class coffee. That's just amazing. And so understanding how do you adapt farming techniques, genetically, what are the best species, maybe Robusta, for different climates? That's a big unanswered research question that we need to think about.
Thank you. Bill, you're obviously working with young people studying coffee. Is studying coffee, is doing research on coffee something that draws young people in actively? Is it something they want to do, or are there other things which are going to be their focus area?
Absolutely. I mean, so the undergraduate course that I teach now has almost 2,000 students per year come through the undergraduate coffee lab at UC Davis. And many of them are just curious about coffee, but of that 2,000 students per year, there's about 10% or so that are just really, really passionate about coffee, really want to go work in the coffee industry, want to learn more about it, want to do research on it. And that's at the undergraduate level. We have many graduate students, not only in engineering, but in the food science, in genetics and things like that want to focus on coffee. I mean, coffee it's a really powerful attractor. I mean, people are really, curious about it. And then when they understand that I can do research on this, they really, we have students lining up out the door basically.
Do you think that's just an American phenomenon mainly, or do you, I mean, are there other research centres at universities that are drawing in large numbers of young people, or should there be? I mean, do we need to start thinking about the next generation?
So this is a point I'd like to make. I mean, like for almost a century now, it's been possible to get a master's degree in viticulture and enology. And so that's wine. You can get a PhD in petroleum engineering. That's another commodity. Where is the graduate education for coffee? And coffee, I think, is more important than petroleum and wine. I mean, it powers the economy, it powers our thought economy. And so, who's going to be training the next generation of thought leaders so that companies in this room, like where can they hire young talent that really already has expertise in coffee? And so that's one thing that I'm very passionate about, like helping set that up.
Yeah, sure. Tim, do you find that it's just in the US that this is a phenomenon, that young people are really keen to get involved in doing research, or when you travel, do you find that it's also the case in Europe?
Even from the producing countries, we have many very excited young people coming out of institutions like Zamorano and others, and they are coming to us with a lot of interest in breeding and agronomy, and it's great because we're hiring them. And don't forget also that not just in the U.S. but in Italy, we have the Trieste, the Coffee University, with excellent collaboration with the universities there, as well as World Coffee Research, and the several other roasting companies involved in this as well. So,
and do you anticipate that in the longer term that the people from producing countries, the young people from producing countries who are coming to work with World Coffee Research, will actually go back into their own countries and beef up and boost the facilities?
Yeah, this is something that I'm very have been working with that for my whole professional career. And yes, they are the ones we are working with are not in France, they're not in the U.S., they are actually in the producing countries. They want to be contributing to coffee in those countries. And, I can name pretty much, there's Rwanda is like that, Kenya has been like that, El Salvador, Guatemala. We're getting excellent individuals coming out of those institutions that do have some coffee curriculum, like Zamorano, for example, in Honduras.
So although the last 20 years or so have seen a lot of a decline in research in producing countries, that could change.
Well, that's the problem.
Eventually.
When they come out of those universities and programs, there basically is no place for them to work in the coffee sector. So the governments, the educational centers produces the students, but actually the many of the coffee research institutes are unable to hire them because they have gone down over the last 20 years with no emphasis in coffee research.
Yeah.
And this is the gap that World Coffee Research is filling, because our whole program is based on a collaboration with the National Coffee Institutes. And a direction to increase the human and infrastructure capacity of those countries.
I guess that comes back to what you were saying earlier, Hans, about governments and countries needing to get involved again in research and to boost their own capabilities.
Well, I'd just like to add one point to this. I was personally very impressed yesterday afternoon, when these young folks were on the stage, these young entrepreneurs, which take on the risk to open coffee shops on that side, and this is also seen in the origin countries, in producer countries, which who also open these shops and bring this into the next generation. Now, sorry, I jumped now your question.
I was just referring to your earlier remarks about producing countries needing to invest in research and have the facilities to undertake.
Yes, absolutely. I think if you see what builds the success in the driving countries, especially I like to mention all the time Colombia on the smallholder side and Brazil more on the plantation side, and smallholder as well, of course. There is an investment not only in research and development of varieties, but there's a lot of solution provided to and education system. There are universities, there are technical developments. So if in Brazil you need a technician, or you need a field agronomist, you need an entomologist, you have those people there coming in constantly. Same in Colombia. I mean, they have an excellent research into it. Zenny Cafe is one of the leaders. So it shows it is possible.
Sure.
But it needs the political will to do it.
Exactly.
And to invest.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I agree. Just one more data point. Every week I get an email from somebody in a developing, producing country somewhere asking where can I sign up for the PhD in coffee science. I mean, so I think there is a strong demand for higher education for building research.
Fair enough. Gentlemen, is it possible sort of to talk about the biggest challenges and opportunities in consuming countries? We focus mainly on producing countries, but what can research do to make coffee an even more attractive beverage? Is research mainly aimed at developing countries or mature markets, such as the US and Europe, or is there a need for research that can help industry develop into new markets? Is that something, Bill, perhaps you could address?
Sure. I mean, so as a chemical engineer, one of the things I'm personally fascinated by is the chemistry and physics of what happens during roasting and brewing, and that historically has not been the subject of very much research in the open literature. And so right now at UC Davis, we have a standing expert panel of tasters where we're working with funding from the Especially Coffee Association to update and expand the classic coffee brewing control chart, which some people in the audience might be familiar with. It was developed in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and hasn't been updated since then, even though the consumer tastes have changed considerably since then. And so that's one thing we're doing right now. We're updating that. I have some of my colleagues, for example, there's a lot of concern about cold brew. Cold brew coffee is exploding right now. And the coffee industry has been very fortunate in the sense that, you have a big kill step, when you roast coffee that takes care of most pathogens. But cold brew coffee, that's a growth medium. And so there's a lot of concern about what are the best practices, for cold brew coffee. And for very large companies that have, whole, food safety experts on staff, that's not as much of a concern. But there's many specialty cafes that don't have food safety experts on staff, and so there's a tremendous education dissemination in terms of best practices for cold brew. And so we have one of my colleagues, Linda Harris, is working on from a microbiology point of view, understanding food safety aspects of cold brew coffee specifically in more detail, so that we can disseminate best practices going
Fair
forward.
enough.
And let me just add that with climate change, it's going to be continually challenging to maintain the quality of the coffee, for consumers in the future, and that is why it's so important to have these national coffee institutes working in collaboration with World Coffee Research, for example, in breeding programs that are indeed pushing the envelope on quality and assuring that quality can be maintained in the producing countries despite the effects of climate change. So it's key to the continuation of a strong dynamic market in consuming countries.
Bill, you guys obviously work quite closely with the SCAE from SCA as now, with whom we're going to hear this afternoon. Can you tell us a bit more about how and why you came to collaborate? And I'd be interested also if you could tell us, is it really only the specialty side of the business that is interested in research or funding research, or is the coffee industry as a whole really interested in getting involved?
So first let me emphasize that we're the UC Davis Coffee Center, not the UC Davis Specialty Coffee Center. So we're really we have a very holistic view of coffee, and that from both very large commodity type coffee to specialty. And we're really interested in answering fundamental questions about coffee science. So the first part of your question is, how did we get involved? My own kind of personal journey is I started thinking about coffee academically about 6 years ago. Initially, just entirely as a pedagogical exercise, just as a teaching tool. And I wanted to use coffee as a fun, interesting working example to teach science and engineering principles at an introductory level. But then very quickly, once we had that class come out, there was a little bit of press attention, and the Specialty Coffee Association heard about it, and then they hopped on a plane and came up and visited Davis, and one thing led to another, and it became very clear very quickly to us that there are huge unmet research and education needs in the coffee industry. And things have gotten bigger now. I'm very delighted to be working with Bill Murray. He's one of the members of our advisory board from the National Coffee Association of the States. And so I think there is a tremendous appetite for research across all scales of the coffee industry.
So it's not simply a specialty coffee thing.
No, it's a coffee period.
Yeah, fair enough. And I just wonder if we could return to roasting, because here we are at the heart of the roasting industry. Can you tell us a bit more about the kind of research that can be done or is being done on roasting, and how it might advance the products that roasters will be selling in the future?
Sure, absolutely. So again, one of the things that I'm personally fascinated is, what are the chemical kinetic reaction pathways that occur during roasting? And so in comparison to, for example, in petroleum, when you crack petroleum, they have a really detailed understanding of all the chemical reactions that are occurring and all everything that's being separated out of the crude oil. Because crude oil actually, I mean, sensorially it's very different, but in terms of chemical composition, in terms of complexity, it's very similar. You pull this, witch's brew out of the ground, and then you do amazing things to it. You make not only gasoline or jet fuel, but plastics. And so the petroleum industry has tremendous expertise in doing that. Coffee is also really complicated. There's about 1,000 different molecules in a cup of coffee, many of which contribute to the aroma. And understand there's, like, in terms of the published open literature, very, very little has been published, especially in comparison to some of these more mature, scientifically mature industries like petroleum and even in wine and things like that. And this isn't specifically roasting, but it astonishes me that I talk to people in the coffee industry now, and there's a lot of, I would say, debate and confusion about whether or not coffee even should be classified as a fermented food product or not. So when you wet wash, everybody talks about the fermentation step. It's not 100% established that it's really the fermentation byproducts that are causing changes in the flavor. There's a whole alternative hypothesis that it's really the abortive germination that's occurring during the wet washing that really triggers a whole cascade of chemical changes that really affect the flavor. And so it's just astonishing to me that, in 2018, we can have debates about, is it a fermented food product or not? Should it be classified like that? And so that really, to me, speaks to the need for kind of more fundamental research that kind of answers some of these basic questions.
Okay, thank you. So, gentlemen, looking along the coffee value chain, where do you see the greatest opportunity to use research to enhance the industry and add value? Do you see the greatest potential on farm, processing, roasting and grinding, brewing, potentially at every stage? Tim, where do you see the greatest potential, or perhaps the greatest need?
Yeah, well, I'll be saying that the greatest need is in the area of science and technology at the producer end of the supply chain. I think that if we're going to face the climate change and all the challenges that come with it, we must be prepared with the proper tools and technologies. And because coffee, as Hans alluded to a minute ago, is an orphan crop, it has not had the funding and to bring it at higher level,
Sorry to interrupt. I remember at another conference you once told me, or told the audience, about the amount of money that had been invested in, was it maize or one other crop? It was many millions of dollars. And do you remember how much?
Well, it's in maize. It was $200 million invested just in the central part of the U.S. That's Nebraska and a few other states in maize variety development research. Okay, and per year producing a 1.5% yield gain over now 40 years. All right, and so a huge investment, a huge return on that investment. And in coffee, it's hard to get the exact figure, but we feel it's the whole world is probably hardly 100 million in the certainly in the area of breeding and agronomy, and I think and that's an overestimate. Another amazing fact is if you look at the number of varieties, that are produced. This is another thing that in a crop like watermelon or even kumquats, you'll see that there's many, even thousands sometimes of varieties, fitting different market situations and this kind of thing in those crops. And in coffee, I think we have 37 registered varieties all over this time, and 8 of those 37 are producing probably 75% of the coffee produced today.
Yeah.
And hey, guess what? They are all brothers and sisters, and there's little wiggle room in terms of what you can do genetically, getting back to the point of the need for assistance in genetic conservation.
Yeah. And Hans, what about you? Where do you see the biggest opportunity?
Well, picking up that point, this 1.5% growth in that, you have to understand that the grain production runs at a high intensive agronomic system with precision farming, really an optimized agronomic system. And that advantage needs an agronomic system. With that, I would like to say, before new varieties and better producing clones can take their effect, the fundamentals have to be there. A proper agronomic concept, going down as simple as ground cover and pruning and crop nutrition. I mean, you can bring the best variety or the best clone. If that is not there, you don't take an advantage out of this. Maybe, okay, rust resistance surely will help any producer, but these fundamentals also need to be addressed. Otherwise, those new clones and new varieties will again help those which are already good, make them better, and the others are lagging behind.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. That's correct, yeah.
Bill, I guess you would see opportunities at both ends of the value chain, really, or throughout, maybe.
No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, so as this whole conversation is showing, there's a long supply chain, long, in chemical engineering terms, many unit operations that have to be conducted properly to get a good cup of coffee. And that starts, with the DNA and the seed and the agronomy and the plant sciences and the, fungicide and then the, just everything, all those steps. And so, I'm a chemical engineer, but I have colleagues at UC Davis who focus on that aspect. What UC Davis is trying to do is really bring together a large group of people with expertise across all those different steps so that we can serve as a nexus of knowledge and expertise for the coffee industry.
Yeah. And one last question to each of you. Is there anything we're overlooking? Are there any areas that you still believe need attention? And if so, what might they be? Is there anything that we haven't begun to address as far as research and science is concerned?
Well, one thing we don't have and we need so badly and all over the industry is statistics, is the numbers. You cannot, I remember distinctly the rust crisis of 2012. We called a summit in Guatemala, and when we went around to different countries, impossible to know exactly where the rust was, what's being affected, how many trees, what varieties, all this kind of, it's amazing the lack of information in the producing countries. And without that, it's hard to plan and measure your progress in research, development, or most of
Hans, would you agree?
Well, a last word from my side. Look, the coffee market has the luxury that it is predictable. It has been predictable over the last 35 years by a constant growth, every year more. Today, 2% more coffee, talking about 3 million bags, 1.5 times Kenya and Tanzania together, additional. So it is a predictable, there's a luxury market where you can say, it's going that way. If this pace continues, then in the next 35 years, we need 160 million bags more. I don't think will be quite so much, but there is a growing market. So it's worth investing into this science and technology on the production side, not to make it a monoculture. I mean, we need different qualities. We need fancy. We need medium grown. We need these different qualities, but we need must make sure that those countries also take on their responsibility, make it a will, cooperate with research organizations like yours, and not only to have a nice few varieties, but make it a policy and a priority.
Exactly.
Bill, is there anything we're overlooking from your point of view?
I think they already hit some of the key points. I'll just reiterate the importance of intellectual, expertise, and universities play a key role in developing that. And so I think the coffee industry, in some senses, hasn't known that it's been missing its left hand for a long time. Other industries have, the luxury of having a pipeline, an academic pipeline of expertise to hire from. And so that's, when we talk about science and research and development, who's doing that? It's students that you've trained up to be doing that. And so that's what we're trying to build.
Great, thank you, gentlemen. I'd like to conclude by saying that the vital research that the organisations we've heard from this morning, from World Coffee Research and UC Davis, it doesn't take place in a vacuum, and it needs funding. And if there are any of you here who aren't already involved in assisting with that work, do take the opportunity to have a chat with Bill, have a coffee, have a chat with Tim, and see if there's any way that you might be able to get involved. But for now, perhaps we could just thank our excellent panelists. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.